My name is Isaac Shub, and work in the reference department here. I'm here with librarian Marion Huggins, and we're joined by Professor Gerald Horne. Professor Horne grew up in St. Louis, did undergraduate work at Princeton, earned a law degree from UC Berkeley, and received his PhD from Columbia. He holds the Moores Professorship of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. And his new book, which we'll talk about today as part of a Book Sandwiched In series, is The Dawning of the Apocalypse, The Roots of Slavery, Settler Colonialism, and Capitalism in the Long 16th Century. Thank you very much, Marion.
I had the pleasure of introducing Dr. Horne at another NHFPL book talk back in September. Dr. Horne, I don't know if you remember, but we talked about your Paul Robeson. We talked about your Paul Robeson book. That was a great book talk. When I heard you were coming back, I said, "Oh no, you gotta let me in on this." So I begged my way in so that I can see you again and make you feel welcome.
Well, thank you.
Today we're discussing your newest book.
Looks like we're having
some keep looking at the title. The Dawn Apocalypse, The Roots of Slavery, White Supremacy.
Looks like we're having some technical problems, Marion.
Settler colonialism and capitalism in the long 16th century. Tell me.
Professor Horne, are you able to
if I need to say that again.
I hear Shub better than Huggins.
Okay. So Marion, I guess we're having a little bit of trouble. We were just watching a video with you recently, Professor Horne, where there were a lot of technical difficulties, and we were just hoping that we would elude them, but we have not. So I just wanted to start off by asking you, this is like fairly, general, but in your book, you walk us through a story of how Spain gave way to England and subsequently the US, as England and the US were these colonial powers, and their method of domination involved the concept of whiteness, whereas Spain had been attempting to dominate using Catholicism. Please, correct me if this is not really accurate. And as you know, one of those categories, of course, is more exclusive and fixed than the other. You can force conversion to Catholicism, but that concept of whiteness could be used in an exclusive way. And at one point you say settler colonialism was a pan-European project containing the germ of whiteness. So again, this is a very basic, general question, but can you walk us through some of the historical phases that you go through and how that evolved?
Well, first of all, with regard to Spain versus England, Spain had a first mover's advantage, as is obvious, since it sponsored the freebooter Christopher Columbus in 1492. And Spain, as you suggest, had a religious qualification for settlement. I'm not sure if they realized that when Martin Luther came along, circa 1517, shortly after Columbus's voyage, with his secession from the Vatican, that inaugurated a new stage. That new stage was punctuated when, you may recall, in the 1530s, when, as the fable goes, King Henry VIII in London was having trouble effectuating divorces, and that impelled him to defect to the Protestant side, where official London still resides. This helps to inaugurate a chain reaction of religious conflicts and religious wars between Protestants and Catholics. To begin with, of course, the wars involve Catholic Spain versus Protestant Holland, but never far behind is Protestant England. Now, what's interesting is that England was the scrappy underdog. It had less margin for error. Spain, on the other hand, was in a sense the superpower. But what happens is that in many ways, London cuts a deal with the Muslim powers. First of all, it cuts a deal with Ottoman Turkey when the Catholics are expropriated in the 1530s and to a certain degree liquidated. What happens is that a good deal of the wealth from that the Catholics had accumulated in what came to be known as the British Isles was shipped eastward to Ottoman Turkey. There was a de facto alliance in many ways between the English and the rising Muslim powers, which obviously outraged the Catholic powers, because one of the factors that helped to impel the Spanish to sail westward across the Atlantic in 1492 was that they were under tremendous pressure from the Muslims. You may recall that it was only in 1492 that the last Muslim-dominated precincts on the Iberian Peninsula were disassembled, so to speak. And the Ottoman Turks have been placing enormous pressure on Western Europe. And as I suggest, in some ways, you can see the sailing westward as a way to escape this pressure from the Muslims. 1492 is also the year where you see the acceleration of the expulsion of the Jewish population from the Iberian Peninsula, with many of them, of course, fleeing to Ottoman Turkey, some of them fleeing ultimately to Protestant Holland and ultimately Protestant London, which was something of a turnabout, because recall that England itself had begun the expulsion of its own Jewish population 200 years earlier, circa 1290, 1291. In any case, in the midst of all of this turmoil, you also see that Spain is trying to establish settlements on the North American mainland. It does so successfully in what they call Florida, about a few decades after the sailing westward of Christopher Columbus. And you also see that as early as 1565, the Spanish, with enslaved Africans in tow, had established a settlement in what is now St. Augustine, Florida, which continues to bill itself as the longest standing urban node on the North American continent. But recall that as early as the 1520s, you saw that the,
Did you,
okay.
There you are.
Okay, sorry about that. As early as the 1520s, from their perch in Santo Domingo, Spain had sailed northward to establish a settlement in what is now South Carolina, or just north of Florida, I should say. But what happens is that the enslaved Africans who were part of this assemblage defect to the Native American side, chase the Spanish back to the Caribbean, and so ends that effort to establish a settlement north of Florida. The inference you should draw from that is that in many ways, the fierce militancy of the Africans helped to forestall the creation of a Spanish settlement on the North American mainland, which helps to explain why we're on the North American mainland now speaking English instead of Spanish and not being here at all. You also see that with regard to the successful settlement that is established in what is called Virginia in 1607. The Spanish from their perch in Florida were more than willing to sail northward to attempt to liquidate that English settlement in what was called Virginia, but they were so tied down combating and fighting the enslaved Africans and the indigenous population that they were unable to do so, thereby giving that settlement a lease on life, so to speak. and the descendants of that settlement, the legacy of that settlement exists to this very day. I should also say that with regard to this alliance with the Muslims, which I think was one of the key factors in helping to explain London's ascendancy. And of course, you see this sprinkled throughout a number of Shakespeare's plays, not least Othello, but a number of other plays where scholars have been puzzling over why you have these positive portrayals of Muslims or humane portrayals of Muslims. I think that they may be looking too much from the vantage point of the 21st century rather than the vantage point of the late 16th century or the early 17th century for that matter. And so in 1591, for example, you see an alliance between London and Morocco, North Africa, to attack the Songhai Empire, which is a major political entity in Africa, due south of Morocco. And it is successfully vanquished because of this dual alliance, this alliance between English and Morocco. This helps to destabilize not only the Songhai Empire, but it ricochets and cascades southward and westward, helping to soften up the African continent for the onrushing African slave trade, and which of course takes off like a rocket about a half century later as London climbs the greasy pole of colonial success. So the analogy that I have drawn in passing in the book in question, and I'll mention it here because oftentimes I've noticed people in the United States, which is understandable, they want you to draw contemporary lessons. So one lesson that may be unsettling to some is that if you look at today's constellation of forces, with China in the passing lane, for example, this is a direct result of events that took place a half century ago when your fellow nutmeg state resident, Henry Kissinger, flew across the Pacific to effectuate an entente with China on an anti-Soviet basis. Obviously, the United States, when they cut that deal, they did not envision China eventually being in the passing lane, which is where they are now. And now you have the current administration basically trying to forge alliances globally with India, European Union, Japan, Australia, South Korea, et cetera, to encircle China, trying to use every play in the playbook, including, according to Admiral Charles Richard, one of the leading Pentagon officials, including buckle your seatbelts, war. So in other words, this underestimation of nations is not something that's peculiar to the 16th century. Now, that's been my long-winded response to your very intelligent and simple question. So I'll pause and let you pose another intelligent question.
Well, Marion, do you want to? You have a whole list of questions that you prepared.
I did, but I'm worried. Can you guys hear me all right now?
We can.
I can.
Okay, good. So I did see you in that interview on YouTube with Jared Bell, and you talked about the year 1619 as emphasized by the New York Times. Mm-hmm. And you just reiterated how Spain had beat England to the punch, but their people had run off in the area where we call South Carolina in the 1520s, and those Africans had run off with the indigenous population. You said that we fixate on this 1619, and this is a kind of English centrism. Are there other European influences here in the U.S. that we ignore due to English centrism?
Oh, sure. And let me say that I salute the New York Times 1619 project. I think that these journalists led by Nicole Hannah-Jones we're really trying to fill a vacuum that has been left by historians, the members of my guild, who I don't think have done a very good job in terms of their chosen profession in explaining some of the events that I've just explained. And I think that also sheds light on why people were so shocked and surprised by the events of January 6, 2021, where if you would listen to the historians, that sort of event would never happen in the United States of America. Because, of course, we know that in 1776, there was constructed this sturdy republic with a sturdier constitution, with these democratic rights guaranteed for all. And January 6, 2021 came as a bolt from the blue. But to answer your question, number one, of course, there's the influence of France, which I think has been underestimated. I mean, for example, we know, of course, about the French role in Louisiana. We know that to this very day, you have many enslaved Africans who carry French surnames who have roots in Louisiana. We know that during the U.S. Civil War, France had occupied Mexico. And indeed, the Confederates had concocted this scheme to have Texas, which is seceded from Mexico in 1836, not least because Mexico had moved to abolish slavery beforehand. They had concocted this scheme for Texas, which was under Confederate rule, to somehow merge with French Mexico against the interests of the United States of America. And that scheme was barely throttled. Otherwise, sitting here in Texas, I might be speaking French now instead of English. We know that from its perch in Quebec, just north of New York City, that French interests were involved in these slave uprising in New York City, 1712, just like the bloodiest slave revolt on the North American continent, that is to say, Stonewall's Revolt, circa 1739, 1740 in South Carolina, that was fundamentally instigated by armed Africans from Spanish Florida, for example. I think that part of the problem is not only English centrism, is that many of the historians, they treat the United States as sort of a thing in itself. Even though we know, for example, with regard to the retreat of Jim Crow in the 20th century, that has everything to do with the rise of national liberation movements in Africa and the Caribbean, the United States feeling that it's going to be beaten to the punch by the socialist camp. And so therefore that impels Washington to make an agonizing retreat from the more egregious aspects of Jim Crow. So trying to treat the United States as sort of a thing in itself, I think it is a wrong-headed way of doing history. And inevitably, it ends with wrong-headed conclusions. I mean, in North America, for example, at various moments, you had the Dutch, for example, controlling what is now New York City. I mentioned in the previous question about how the Dutch were early movers with regard to colonialism. And I say in the book that in some ways, the English were using the Dutch as a kind of sock puppet. They were pushing the Dutch ahead as it confronted bloodily the Spanish. And it was only in the middle of the 17th century that England is able to oust the Dutch from what is now New York City, the premier city in North America as we speak. You had Swedish interests who were involved in a colonial enterprise just south of what is now Philadelphia, for example, around the area of Delaware. So, I mean, I could go on in this vein, but once again, I would say that the historians, even when they try to write textbooks, which gives you the opportunity to broaden the discussion, they oftentimes are not successful or enlightening in terms of portraying this broader picture of how this country known as the United States of America came to be.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Can I go again?
Oh, please, please.
In the introduction, you said that in a sense, Madrid took religion too seriously.
That's right.
Seeming oblivious to the rising notion that settler colonialism required race more than religion. Are you saying that Spain wasn't successful because they required their Spanish settlers to be Catholic?
Well, what I'm suggesting that in the contestation with London, I mean, I'm looking at it relatively. I mean, I think that if they were not facing competitors, religion may have, quote, worked, unquote, but you know, in the real world, they were facing competitors. And what I mean by that in terms of religion as a qualification for settlement, from the beginnings of Spanish Cuba, you had Black conquistadors, or you had Black men in particular who were armed. And this was the case. And this also, interestingly enough, if you look at the origins of Texas, when Stephen F. Austin, about 200 years ago, cuts a deal with a newly emerging government in Mexico to establish a settlement in Tejas, that Stephen F. Austin and his comrades had to profess Catholicism, even though some of his comrades, you could say at best, were nominally Catholic. I think that having religion as a qualification also opened the door to what we know transpired, which is turning a goodly number of the Jewish population against Madrid, not least because of the Inquisition, not least because of this idea that you had to become Catholic or be tortured, or become Catholic or die. That's not the best way to win friends, allies, and comrades. This drove this population into the waiting arms, as noted, of the Ottoman Turks, of Protestant London, of Protestant Holland. And this was a major disadvantage for the Spanish going forward. So once again, I think that the problem, there are many problems with colonialism. There are many problems with settler colonialism. And a problem with regard to having a religious qualification for colonialism and settler colonialism is that it creates many numerous problems. Whereas if you look at whiteness by way of contrast, number one, it allows England to work out agreements with those whom it had been warring with, the Irish and the Scots in the first instance. In fact, one of the sub-themes of my book is that this warring with the Irish and the Scots in many ways was practice that could then be used against the Africans and the indigenous of the Americas, not least in terms of developing an arms industry to a degree that has been bequeathed to its revolting spawn, now known as the United States of America. And then this construction of whiteness, whereby those who have been warring on the shores of Europe in a maneuver that would make Madison Avenue blush, they're magically transformed into, quote, whites, unquote, once they land in North America. This has boundless expansionist tendencies. For example, British had been warring against Germans. Germans have been warring against Poles. Poles have been warring against Russians. Serbs have been warring against Croats. Croats have been warring against Serbs, Northern Italians versus Southern Italians. All of a sudden, when they cross the Atlantic, they're transmuted into white. It creates a broader base for settler colonialism. And it also, by casting into a site south of Purgatory, those who are not inducted into the hallowed halls of whiteness, speaking of people of African descent, the indigenous population, it creates this marker in terms of phenotype, which makes them readily and easily identifiable, unlike religion, for example, where there can be a mystery as to who is actually a believer. And in fact, people can fake believing. You know, you do the sign of the cross, etc. So in terms of the ugliness and griminess that is involved in settler colonialism, which presupposes liquidation of the indigenous population, the seizing and dispossession of the indigenous population, the mass enslavement and brutalization of the Africans, it turns out that race triumphs over religion. Now, I also indicate towards the end of the first chapter of the introduction of the book we're discussing that how that whole process begins to disintegrate. It begins to disintegrate with the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, which creates a general crisis of the entire slave system, which could only be resolved with its collapse, and moves London to decide to move away from the slave trade, move away from slavery ultimately in the 1830s and its cash cows of Jamaica, Barbados, etc. And then, of course, it unleashes forces that impels the United States itself to move away from slavery by dint of a bloody civil war, whereby tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands were slaughtered on the battlefields of North America. And this then helps to give impetus to the rise of a labor movement. The struggle for an 8-hour day, for example, unsurprisingly erupts successfully after the abolition of slavery. And then with the Russian Revolution, 1917, you have the creation of these class-based socialist projects, which, as noted, then puts pressure on the United States to move away from more egregious aspects of US apartheid, the system that had been established post-1865, US Jim Crow. But alas, of late, we've had a certain retreat of socialist-based projects, which, in my estimation, has helped to give rise to a kind of white Christian nationalism, which then you saw explode in the halls of Congress on January 6, 2021. So there you have it.
So I'm going to jump way forward in the book because I know it's so rich, and I know that you could talk to us for an hour. But I do want to make sure that we talk about climate change.
Oh yes.
Before I want to know. Like, I thought it was really surprising that climate change came up in this book, because I thought this book was only going to be about things that happened in the 16th century. And it seems to me that you were making the case that all those events led us up to the Industrial Revolution and then also climate change. So can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, I will elaborate on it a little bit, because I have to be honest that in making that thesis, I was drawing upon the work of other scholars, particularly these scholars at Ohio State University, whose names now have suddenly escaped me. So that was not necessarily original on my part. I mean, you know how the saying goes: everybody borrows. Just make sure you borrow from somebody who knows what they're talking about. So hopefully that's what I did when I was borrowing those ideas concerning climate change from these Ohio State University professors. But in short, what was happening is that the climate was changing. You were having cold spells, which were then contributing in North America, hitting very disastrously, which was compromising the well-being of the indigenous population, making them more susceptible to being overrun by the advanced military technology of the European invaders, for example, And I actually talk about climate change as well in my book on the 17th century, which chronologically was published before the 16th century book, but obviously in terms of chronology of the 17th century follows the 16th century. So I'll stop at that point.
So then you also, you've kind of talked to us about the Pan-European project, and I mean, it sounds like what you were describing is Pan-Europeanism, what developed through the the end of using religion and the beginning of using or more using this concept of whiteness. How does that relate to class collaboration? Because that's another theme of your book. Is that is that the same thing? Is that related?
Well, thank you. Class collaboration inheres in settler colonialism, London style. If you look at the first settlers sent across the Atlantic to what is now North Carolina in the 1580s, it was a multi-class formation, basically. You had English men and women from different class backgrounds, from shopkeepers to skilled workers, for example, but all sponsored by the economic royalists in this project whereby all would profit insofar as the late Native Americans were expropriated, for example, and with eventually enslaved Africans coming across the Atlantic to do all the dirty work. And likewise, if you look at the 1607 venture into what is called Virginia, you have a similar sort of class makeup with the economic royalists sponsoring the middle class, skilled workers, etc. And interestingly enough, if you look at the class makeup of those who invaded the Capitol on January 6, 2021, once again, it's a multi-class formation. You have a CEO arrested. You have shopkeepers from Beverly Hills, for example. You have transit workers, police officers, military veterans, Olympic athletes, unemployed, lumpen elements, etc. And so, to a certain extent, it mirrored the origins of the settler colonial project. And I think, assuming that the words of Admiral Richard, who I quoted earlier about war with China, assuming his words do not come to fruition, I think that future historians will wonder if they gave too much emphasis to how the disruption of the status quo was greeted warmly in the United States of America. That is to say, you get this idea, despite federal troops having to be called into Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957, Oxford, Mississippi, 1962, the eruptions in Boston over school desegregation in the 1970s, the fierce fights in Yonkers, New York in the 1980s over housing desegregation. Somehow you get the idea that this transition from US apartheid to whatever it is we have today was somehow greeted unanimously. And I think a lot of people didn't think that was a very good idea at all, which is why they were rioting in the streets, which is one of the reasons I think that they were rioting in the Capitol just weeks ago. And so I think we need really to take more seriously, and because usually the line from these historians is that they treat the Constitution as some sort of magic talisman, that all you have to do is say, oh, 1954, we were wrong constitutionally when we said that Jim Crow was legal. And then everybody said, hey, you're right. We misinterpreted the Constitution. I mean, it really takes off the battlefield people. It takes off the battlefield people struggling and invest in this document some sort of magical property. I should say by the same token that of course, there has been class struggle in the United States. Otherwise, things would be worse than they are. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the unions that we do have, which are designed to protect and advance the interests of the working class. But I will also say that from the inception, you've had class struggle on the part of enslaved Africans. Because even though some of our liberal and left friends, they tend to refer to Black people as some sort of identity grouping. I'm not sure what that means, but I think it's meant to be dismissive. When actually, you're talking about a group that was locked into a very cruel and antagonistic class relationship with the slaveholder holding the reins of power, of forcing the enslaved to work for free, which inevitably leads to conflict and discord. It leads to slave revolts, slave rebellions, and it's not accidental that in 2020, that those who carry the legacy of that particular class struggle are more likely to vote against the right than any other demographic in the United States. And likewise, I don't think you can begin to understand the Trump coalition of why 74 million people voted for him in 2020 without understanding this concept of class collaboration. And that leads me to this point, if I may, pardon me for veering outside of the 16th century, but what can I tell you? So it seems to me that the 1%, the economic royalists, in light of January 6th, may be rethinking their electoral options. What I mean is having foot soldiers in the Euro-American working class and middle class cast their votes for the GOP, which then goes to Washington and executes tax cuts for the 1% and other giveaways, deregulation, et cetera, with the foot soldiers not necessarily profiting as well, which is reflected in recent literature. For example, the book by Angus Deaton, D-E-A-T-O-N, Deaths of Despair, which for whatever reason focuses on the white working class and the deaths by opioids and alcoholism, suicide, etc. And so what's interesting is that if you look at these social scientists now, they're beginning to sing a different tune. Charles Murray, you might recall Charles Murray, he's a social scientist in quotation marks, who some years ago co-authored a book called The Bell Curve, where he suggested that Black people were genetically inferior. That was the source of our problems. And he was part of a cabal that I'm afraid to say included the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan that suggested that our purported pathologies were so profound that we were undergoing speciation. We're becoming a different species. His latest book attacks the white working class and the white poor in similar terms. Likewise, Keith Williamson, who is a columnist for the National Review, founded by your fellow nutmeg stater, William F. Buckley, some decades ago, has a new book out, Big White Ghetto, where he talks about that group in terms that are more extreme than Charles Murray. And in fact, Joe Scarborough, the former Republican congressman, now hosts the Morning Joe and MSNBC, he read out verbatim one of Kevin Williamson's chapters, I should say portions of a chapter that was recently reprinted in the National Review. And then if you look at Hollywood, the new movie Hillbilly Elegy, starring Glenn Close, I think she might have some Connecticut roots too, has the cinematic version of the alleged and purported pathologies of the white poor and white working class. And so one of the points that I'm inferring is that the 1% may underline may be reconsidering its electoral options. And the advantage of the Biden coalition is that it relies heavily on the Black vote, but because of the pummeling that was given people like Paul Robeson, for example, the Black Americans who ventured into foreign policy, there has been a hesitancy of Black Americans to venture into foreign policy. And so that gives the 1% and the Biden coalition more leeway and latitude on the international scene, although they will have to make some domestic concessions. So that's another long-winded response.
Well, there's a lot to chew on there. So when you talk about the people who stormed the Capitol, you know, talk about the it sounds like, you know, we're not really a class-based society anymore. Is that right? I mean, you kind of have, you know, the very rich, and then you sort of have the very poor, and then you have everyone else. Is that how you see it? That these are, you know, these are a group of people, some more precarious than others, some who just think they're precarious, maybe.
Well, I mean, I think we have a class-based society, but I think the problem is that people don't necessarily have class consciousness. I think that based upon their reading of history, many of those in the Trump coalition, they feel, I assume, that if they support tax cuts for the 1%, that ultimately they will become part of the 1%, and therefore they can benefit from those tax cuts once they climb the class ladder. I assume that's the reasoning. Or perhaps they think that even though I'm not doing well today, I'll be advantaged over some person of color with regard to a particular job or position, which gives me an investment in the status quo. I mean, I'm assuming that's part of the reasoning. So my short answer is that I think we do have a class-based society. The problem is not sufficient class consciousness, and not sufficient class struggle, for that matter.
Yeah. Well, we do have a question here. Do you mind if I introduce?
Oh, please.
From the audience. This person says, can you talk a little bit more about the white Christian nationalism you mentioned a bit earlier? And so we already spoke a little bit about this, but how has the U.S.'s past laid the groundwork to embolden modern day white nationalists, such as the people who stormed the Capitol?
Well, as the questioner probably knows, a significant part of the Trump base were so-called Christian evangelicals, so-called white Christian evangelicals, not necessarily Black Christian evangelicals. And I would argue, and I have argued and will argue, that what's happened is that the United States was too successful, quote unquote, in destabilizing class-based entities, trade unions in the first instance. Go back to the Taft-Hartley Law of 1947, for example, or the so-called right-to-work laws, or right-to-work-for-less laws, as we oftentimes call them. And that helped to create a kind of vacuum that's been filled by the resurgence of these various forms of religion. Actually, this is a global phenomenon. I mean, you see a similar process in certain parts of Africa, for example, where you've had a destabilization of left-leaning formations and political parties. And with their destabilization, you see the rise of religious zealotry. For example, Mozambique, it came to independence in 1975 under the Frelimo Party, which was espousing a kind of socialism. Its leader and founder, Samora Machel, was killed mysteriously in a plane accident, a familiar phrase, I'm afraid to say, in the mid-1980s. And then now, today, Mozambique is being bedeviled by a insurgency of religious zealots, for example. And I would say also that if you look at the First Amendment, the much heralded First Amendment to the US Constitution, which guarantees freedom of religion, the way I interpret that was a kind of ceasefire in the religious wars, particularly between Protestants and Catholics, which then creates a smoother path for the ascendancy of whiteness. But even with the First Amendment, you know that there was religious bigotry directed against the Catholic population in the United States. Convents burned down in the 1830s, for example. It's been 105 years since Leo Frank, a Jewish manager, was lynched in Georgia by Christian zealots, for example, which helps to give rise to more German American Jewish populations contributing to the NAACP, only founded in 1909. So once again, it seems to me that the surge of this white Christian nationalism, which we saw expressed on January 6, 2021. And by the way, to get a direct look at what I'm talking about, look at the video that was captured by the New Yorker journalist Luke Mogelson, Mogelson. It's probably on YouTube or on the New Yorker website, which has the invaders of the Capitol giving various prayers. They stopped in the middle of their pillaging to have prayers, for example. And he details this, of course, in the article he writes for the New Yorker that came out a week or two ago.
Marion, do you have, are there other things in the book that we wanted to discuss that we haven't yet?
I think that I was interested in the building up of ammunition that you mentioned in chapter 8. That the arms race gave London preeminence by selling defective weapons to the Africans,
right,
further destabilizing Africa and making those ethnic groups fall so that then they could be enslaved.
Well, that's one of the stories of this book, which is what happens to Africa, particularly West Africa, but not exclusively West Africa, because a significant percentage of African Americans have roots in East Africa, in Mozambique, the country I just made reference to, for example. So what happens is, as noted, is that there's a certain contiguity with regard to Western Europeans. I mean, if you look at your map, you'll see that Western Europe is not very big compared to the rest of Europe, which is mostly Russia, or even to, say, Africa, for example. And so they're living together cheek by jowl. There's ethnic conflict between and amongst them, which then leads to wars, which then helps to give rise to a kind of nascent military-industrial complex. So you can fight your antagonists, and as noted, those are fungible skills, quote unquote, that can be easily deployed against Africans and against indigenous populations of the Americas. And at the same time, it generates capital because, as noted, you can sell defective weapons to Africans, obsolete weapons to Africans. And even if you're selling non-defective, non-obsolete weapons to Africans, what that means is that you can stoke conflict, you can stoke wars, which gives rise to prisoners of war, who then become subject to being sold into slavery and dragged across the Atlantic. And that's basically the innards of the business model, if you like, that helps to give rise to settler colonialism, white supremacy, slavery, and ultimately capitalism. Now, in my book on the 17th century, I talk about the turning point for London and indeed the world, which comes after the rise of Oliver Cromwell and the Republican revolt against the monarch in England, the 1640s and 1650s, where the monarch is beheaded. And during this time of Republican rule, I also point out that after the, just parenthetically, after the dislodging of Oliver Cromwell, who, by the way, he's buried after he dies, and then his antagonists dig him up and shoot him some more and then rebury him. They were so angry. In any case, just parenthetically, it's interesting that some of the early settlers, including in the Nutmeg in Connecticut, are these folks who were comrades of Oliver Cromwell, who after the monarchy surges are looking for a place to flee. And some of the early Republican sentiments in North America are coming from these followers and comrades of Oliver Cromwell. In any case, in the 1650s, what happens is that Cromwell is able to dislodge the Spanish from Jamaica. The ultimate plan was to dislodge Spain from the entire Caribbean, but that did not happen. But dislodging the Spanish from Jamaica does happen. And simultaneously, the Dutch, the fellow Protestants, are being ousted from Brazil. They had taken over Brazil temporarily from the Portuguese. As was their tendency, they had welcomed Jewish entrepreneurs and planters to Brazil. But with the Dutch being ousted, these Jewish entrepreneurs and planters were looking for a place to land. Serendipitously for them, Jamaica had just been seized by Protestants, the English. So many of them flee with their capital to Jamaica. That leads to a sugar boom. That is to say, they have mastered the grimy art of producing sugar from the unpaid labor of Africans. That grimy art is then taken to Jamaica. It leads to a so-called sugar boom that quickly spreads to other British possessions in the Caribbean, which creates tremendous wealth because sugar was not only seen as a way to sweeten your coffee or tea, it was seen as a miracle drug to a certain degree, believe it or not. And with this capital flowing into the coffers of London, it allows for the arming of a more militarized military. It allows for the construction of more ships that can be used to transport settlers across the Atlantic, that could be used to transport more enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. The shipping industry requires workers who then can be paid wages, which then those wages can be recirculated in the English economy, leading to a further frothy economy. And therein, you begin to see the takeoff of London or England as a major power. And the African slave trade circa 1672 is then systematized under the rubric of the Royal African Company, but it's under the thumb of the monarch. But what happens with the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688 is that the merchant class, once in on the wealth, they clip the wings of the monarch. And to this day, as you probably know, the monarch in England is a kind of figurehead, certainly not wielding the kind of power that, say, King Henry VIII would have wielded in the 1530s. And with the opening up of the African slave trade to the merchants, you see the merchants descending upon West Africa with a maniacal energy of crazed bees, handcuffing and manacling every African in sight, dragging them across the Atlantic. Therein, you begin to see the takeoff of the African slave trade, the takeoff of wealth in London, the acceleration of settler colonies in North America. But of course, you also begin to see slave revolts, particularly in the Caribbean, which then in turn leads to what I call a great trek of European settlers from the Caribbean to the North American mainland, trying to escape the wrath of ferocious Africans. That benefits the settlements in North America. South Carolina, for example, in many ways is an adjunct of Barbados, which has long been acknowledged. And of course, just to continue the story, what happens is that, as already noted, you have the Spanish seeking to rile up the Africans in South Carolina, the French seeking to rile up the Africans in New York. London expends blood and treasure during the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, basically eliminating the Spanish threat from Florida and the French threat from Quebec, taking over all of Canada. They go to the settlers in North America, Connecticut, etc., to get taxes to pay for this venture that benefited them. The settlers, perhaps because they're so accustomed to getting things for free by dint of slave labor, don't want to pay taxes, which is still their tendency. And that, along with the London Edict, the Royal Proclamation of 1762, 1763, seeking to restrain the settlers from moving west, seizing the land of the Native Americans, which riles up real estate speculators like George Washington, not to mention the Somerset's case of 1772, where slavery is illegalized in England, and the fear that that would leapfrog the Atlantic, jeopardizing slave fortunes of Washington, Jefferson, Madison, stokes an anti-colonial revolt, so-called, that leads to the formation of the United States post-1776, and here we are.
Well, thank you for bringing us to such a tidy conclusion. I'm sorry, go ahead, Marion.
That was a tidy conclusion. Yes, that was a tidy conclusion and quite a history lesson, or I should say a reminder. Unfortunately, that's not the history lesson that most of us learned in school. So we are really advantaged having you here, Dr. Horne. We appreciate it. It's about 1 o'clock, 3 more minutes. I see we moved into your lunchtime. Thank you again. Thank you for coming on.
Yeah.
Appreciate you.
Thank you very much.
You're watching Book TV on C-SPAN 2. Every weekend with the latest nonfiction books